know, when I was talking about encouraging growth in the African area, I was fortunate that I had some time, and so I took another Secretary General, who was Margaret, came along later. But yes, so Ruth Wood and I, we went into Africa and started our work in Zimbabwe. Even though they were fairly advanced, there were skills that we could show some of the physios, and indeed some little groups of people who had kids with disabilities and so forth, what to do. She'd worked a lot with children who'd had polio, and there were one or two there, but we saw more later on. So we started there, then went to Kenya. Well, that was an interesting exercise because in the bush of Kenya, just to give you an example, the number of physios in Kenya to population, if you looked at Eden Park and the final of the World Cup, if you looked at all those people sitting there, there was one physio to look after all of those. It was the equivalent of one to virtually 60,000. So, of course, in the bush, on the ground, they were sparse. The cities had a few, and but out in the bush was very, very sparse. So what Ruth and I did, we went out and ran 2 clinics. One out at Nakuru, which is not really in the bush, but they had a hospital there, but it was where the president had a holiday home. And Daniel Arap Moy was the president at the time, and I did get a chance to meet him. He was receptive to what we were trying to do. And so from there we then went out into the bush. It was a bit like stepping back in time, and they took us to an area where there had been a number of families with kids with disabilities. Well, they look on disability as a punishment from God. And so in the course of managing their child, they really don't come out of the rondavel. They leave them inside all the time. They don't like to expose them amongst the others because they were seen then as lesser beings. By virtue of good luck, I always took a collection of photographs of my daughter and her disability, and with her splints on and then in a wheelchair and things like that, and trying to swim, and took them with me. And once I found out who the head of the area troop was, Ruth would deal with the people who'd contracted polio, or any children with polio. They were in a separate group, and they had different sorts of disabilities with paralysis, and they were invariably in calipers and things like this. The other ones who had neurological deficit problems were the ones that were really, because they usually didn't have bowel control and bladder control. They were ones kept inside. So it was my job really to get them out, and so I was able to produce to the head man of the group the importance of get them outside. And we were successful to a degree that whilst we were there, and we might spend, say, 4 days living in these rondavels, and I'd be wearing plastic bags on the feet because there's dirt on the floor. Anyhow, they were wonderful people to work with and very cooperative. We'd get the kids out. Most of them had never seen the light of day, which was quite sad. And a lot of them were very small, and of course everybody else was looking at them when they came out. And I was able to do a few things to help getting them move a little bit, or just showing the people how to stretch their legs, if they had contractures and things like that, and show them so that people in the group, that's their job to help this one who's disadvantaged. You can't leave it to their mum and dad. You're going to come in and do your bit to help this child. And then we did that in a couple of places, and it worked reasonably well because we had a follow-up. We then sent a group into Kenya and Zambia later on, and there was, I think the lady's name was Elizabeth. She came from New Zealand, and her name, was it be Elizabeth or Anne Ellis? I've got it at home somewhere in documents. She went with a group of 3. There was her, there was a lady from England, and a lady from Australia. The 3 of them went in, and they ran programs for kids who had, predominantly they had cerebral palsy problems. Now why I say that is because enormous numbers of kids in Africa have CP, and it's not from birth injury, it's usually from encephalitis, from the malaria, or from persistent gastroenteritis, and they just don't develop when they're babies, you know. Enormous numbers. I went to one school in Cape Town, wonderful school. Brian Reddy, I've never forgotten this guy's name, was the boss. And we went in, and there were 500 kids with CP. A lot lived there in the most beautiful surroundings. There was a lot of corporate sponsorship, hundreds of computers in the place, in those days put in by IBM. A lot of them were bussed in from just out of the town areas and so forth. And so and they were well looked after. But these ones in the bush, they weren't. So fortunately, our ladies went over and they taught the parents and that in the bush what they could do to help these kids, how to do the exercises, help their coordination, get them moving, show them how to make splints out of bits of wood and bits of tire for shoes and stuff, because that's all they had. And that was a real success. And that was in Zambia. There was a little bit in Zimbabwe, maybe Zambia and Kenya in the bush. And these ladies were wonderful. Just as another example, we went to, this was quite funny actually, to a home that was sponsored by English group, and it was called the Dagoretti Children's Home. And I don't know the name of the group that in England that was putting the money up, but they put a lot of money into this big home on the outskirts of the city. And we went in, and there were a number of kids, and from all ages, from babies right through, with all sorts of problems. And the stark reminder when we went into where the babies were, they were all well looked after by ladies. You know, all the African ladies, very caring. Not a picture or a painting on any wall. No visual stimulus you could see, you know. And so the first thing we said, we made a note of that to do something about that. Go outside, and I went into a class they were learning and have been taught various things, and some were partially blind and there's some deaf, and they were there with legs missing and an arm missing, and you know, all sorts of problems like you wouldn't imagine. And they're all in this one room, and we were there a couple of days off and on. We went out on 2 occasions. I went back to this room, and so they used to call me Mr. Big Nose, because all the class, they all have flat African noses, you see, and they were intrigued by my big nose. It was quite hilarious, but they were great, and the kids were cooperative, and they had a lot of learning support staff. It was really an interesting place to go to. All the linen was being dried out on the grass. It was summertime, and so they weren't being hung up anywhere on lines. They were lying on the grass, towels and sheets and so forth. And out they came for lunch. Well, you should have seen it. Talk about a rag-tailed lot. There was the guy who wheeling the chair. He had no legs, but he had 2 arms. The wheelchair had no tyres on it, and no rubber at all. It was just on the rims. He had on his knee, had a little kid who had 1 arm, I think, from memory, and off they were going to lunch. You see, what a great picture. It was quite alarming, but they were quite happy. Remarkable. But there was quite a lot of support given to that home, as opposed to what was happening in the bush. It was quite different. And what you saw in that school in South Africa, in Cape Town, this diversified care was really something that we didn't know how to handle. Because south of Cape Town, there's an area where the people from the homelands come down trying to get work in Cape Town, but they invariably can't because there's just insufficient jobs. And so they live in these big townships, one called Crossroads and the next one called Kalichia, which was, I went with a South African lady there who'd been doing a lot of work with these kids, and I was just by myself this day, and she said, you know, if I wasn't with her she said, you wouldn't be allowed in this place. If you did get in, you wouldn't get out. So I was with her, and she'd been working with a lot of kids with cerebral palsy, and there were those with neurological problems as well. And so we went to where this clinic was, and when I talk about, it's just a massive shanty huts, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people living there, or thousands of people living there. Anyhow, and they knew I was coming, and Sheena Irwin Carruthers, the lady who had English but lived in Cape Town, was there. And so we went to this clinic run by a wonderful girl, Anne, who came from Swaziland. Can't remember her other name currently. And she had all this group, and there were mothers walking in, carrying their babies, for half an hour on their back. There were no roads really. And I know where they were, there was one tap, and I said, what does that tap service? She said, that tap will service 14 of these houses. And that was the only clean water they had. I thought, hell's bells, it's, pretty difficult place to live. And we had a couple of days out amongst these kids and just looked at Anne and what she was doing. A couple of new little skills, and though she kept in very close contact with Sheena, who was part of the South African Society, who worked a lot with the African people. And and I thought, with all the money in the world, you wouldn't know where to start. Simple as that, just impossible. And that was really quite sad. And the difference between that and what we saw in the town was quite devastating. Very, very hard on the mind, and psychologically it had enormous impact on me. I'd previously been out from Johannesburg. We'd been actually, we went out to Soweto and saw the main hospital out there, which has about 2,300 beds. Fantastic hospital, well run, full of all the black patients. They were really great. They were well looked after. There were some aides present in the hospital. They tried to say they only had a few, but there were quite a few. There was a ward that was devoted to people with AIDS. And we saw that in other parts of Africa, and the same in Kenya, where they said, no, we don't have any AIDS here. They didn't want to say there was, but in actual fact there were. We were told on the side by other people that a couple of wards were devoted to the AIDS patients. But we even went to a ward where there was guys who, as I said, this was the heart ward where they'd all been stabbed in the heart. And we were there on a Monday or Tuesday, one of the 2 days, I can't remember, most likely a Monday. And the surgeon who was taking us around said, these guys came in over the weekend, and there were about 8 of them, and he said, they've all been stabbed in the heart. And he said, they're all alive. And he said, we have the best skills for managing these guys. And he said, they'll be home virtually within 7 or 8 days. And he said, what we do is open them up, sew it up, get them going. 2 days they're up, walking up and down stairs. And he said 7 days most of them are at home. And he said, of course, because the drinking was rampant in Soweto, he said it was usually drunkenness, sexual violence, and just wanting to fight. He said those 3 things filled this hospital. It was really quite an eye-opener. But they also had every other patient, with orthopaedic injuries and things like that. They were very well set up, and I think that was funded by the federal government, of course. But Soweto Township they had 14 clinics, like polyclinics, which gave access to people in certain residential areas, and that seemed to work pretty well too. Even, a lot of the ladies who had the children there, they were delivered then home the next day. Really well organised, quite a contrast to what we saw in the homeland territory, or where the people had gone from the homelands, But when I think back, there was pretty good care, and the Black Hospital, Hillbrow in Johannesburg proper was the hospital for the blacks, and they had a number of black physios working there, whom I got to know, and they were really competent, terrific folk. And when we had a social function or a meeting, some of them came along. You know, there was no apartheid between the whites of the society and the blacks. And that's all been resolved now, of course. But it was interesting, when I got back to Australia, I received a phone call from a guy who was the head of the ANC, Australian National Congress, in Australia, and said he had 2 guys from the ANC who were out there who would like to meet with me. So I met with them in the APA office in Concord in those days with the executive officer of the APA, just to make sure he knew what was going on. They knew where I'd been, whom I'd seen, what I'd done. Very interesting. And one of the guys who was there gave me his card, and he was the exiled Minister for Health of the ANC. So when the government changed, he went in as the Minister for Health. It was really quite an interesting program, interesting to do. But they knew what was going on, and that, interestingly, they also knew that I supported them. They knew that I was the guy that was partly responsible for keeping South Africa in the organisation, even though apartheid existed. And I just told them, I said, there was no point of them being on the outside. We could do much more on the inside, which he agreed with, and he knew there was no discrimination, even though the hospitals discriminated. You know, there was in Joburg, in another hospital, which was the university hospital there. I can't remember the name of it now, but there was like a hospital with mirror images, the blacks on one side and the whites on the other. Really quite alarming. But, you know, that's all been resolved. As a contrast, in Kenya, and this is something I must throw in, when we were out at Nakuru, they said, well, there's a Dr. Malik who was very proud of his new accident emergency centre. Let's come and have a look at this. They had a most up-to-date A&E you've ever seen. Absolutely fantastic. He said it was really grand. And he was a Pakistani guy who was working there for some years. Walked around the hospital, and there were guys in prison uniforms. They said, what are these guys doing? Oh, he said, they look after the grounds. And they've got scythes and hooks and everything. I said, well, you know, who looks after them? Oh, he said, there's a couple of guards around here with the guns. But he said, these are the trusted fellows. I said, well, I think I'd rather not be too close to them with what they've got in their hand. Took us into the hospital. As I'm sure a number of people have already seen, there were always, in many places, there's always 2 to a bed. And often one man on the floor in between the beds. So you get 5 into a cubicle quite with 2 beds. And I looked at one guy and I was talking to him, and he had broken his left leg. So he's in traction, and he's got his right leg hanging over the edge of the bed. And next to him was another guy, and he's got his right leg in traction, and his leg hanging. And I couldn't help but say, I said, how long are you there? Oh, he said, we're here for a few weeks. I said, well, you get to know each other like this, don't you? And they both laughed, and they said, yes, but we both come from different tribes and we're going in different directions when we get out. But there they were. You know, I thought, there's no privacy in this place. But that was a really interesting part of my life, and there were many wonderful social experiences.